Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. Today we are on part 11. We're going to go back now from looking at the different branches of Protestantism that's gone to different places and the leaders that developed there, and return to where we started, and that is by looking at further developments within Lutheranism. So we start by looking at the War of Schmalkalden. The Peace of Nuremberg of 1532 gave Protestants the right to practice their faith in their own territories, but they were prohibited from expanding further. It's kind of where we ended when we were looking at the expansion of the Protestant movement. The situation politically favored Protestants to the point where they were allowed to continue to practice their faith, but they were told, now don't go any further with it. Well, of course, they didn't listen to that. So they began to advance, and they continued to advance, and they continued to make a big push as they did so. In spite of this, Protestants continued expanding. While Charles V would have liked to eliminate it, the complex political situation in Germany hampered him. And that's kind of the story of Charles V's dealings with the Protestant movement. He would have liked to have stopped it at a lot of places, but he never really could because things just didn't line up for him to do so. And by the time he really got an opportunity to influence it in a meaningful way, it was too late to stop it. So we see a series of Charles' attempts to intervene and the failure of those attempts. And basically the best he ever really was able to achieve was to come up with some kind of compromises. And he does try a series of those as well, as we'll see. Powerful Catholic princes such as Philip of Hesse, who was also the leader of the League of Schmalkalden, feared Charles V gaining more power. For this reason, though they were Catholic, they did not support Charles' crusade against Protestantism. And this is another thing with Charles. It's interesting that those who should have been his allies in trying to at least slow down the spread of the Protestant movement, in a lot of ways didn't help him because of the political things that were out there. And it's just one more example of how when you have the state trying to run the affairs of the church or the church trying to run the affairs of state, things just don't always end up the way they should. In fact, usually they don't end up the way they should. And it makes people that ought to be on the same side on one issue and not on the same side on the other issue having to decide which one they think is more important. And these Catholic princes decided that the political part was the more important one. So though they agreed with what Charles would have liked to have done to the Protestant Reformation, they didn't want to see him gain more power. And as a result of that, they knew they couldn't support him in anything. So even stopping the spread of the Protestant movement wasn't enough for them to give up on that idea. In 1534, Philip of Hesse wrested the Duchy of Württemberg from the Catholics who had taken possession of it. After invading the duchy, he recalled its exiled duke, who then declared himself for Protestantism. Now, that word duchy is probably one you're not familiar with. I wasn't familiar with it until going back through this and looking at these things again. But it's a place where people live. It's one of the ways that they named them. So you could say a town, an area, a city, however you want to put that. They have a different name for it than we use today, or at least in our country. They may still use it around the world, but that's what it was. And what had happened was Catholics had come in and taken over. They had run the legitimate ruler out. He was a duke. They got him out of there and they took over. So Philip of Hesse then comes back and he retakes it, and he actually recalls he didn't want to rule it. He brought the duke back in, but what he did want to do was he wanted to declare Protestantism to be the religion of the area, and he did. The population of the duchy soon embraced Lutheranism. So if the ruler takes on a religious stance, then typically the people are going to follow suit, and that's what happened here as well. At this time, Catholicism was suffering a lot of blows. Protestantism was on the move, it was on the rise, and Catholicism, at least in Germany, was having to take some punches. We'll look at several of those now. Another severe blow for German Catholicism was the death of Duke George of Saxony in 1539. Well, why was that a big deal? Saxony comprised two separate territories, Ducal Saxony and Electoral Saxony. Electoral Saxony had been the cradle of Lutheranism, but Ducal Saxony had resisted. So this was kind of the same area, but it was separated into two territories. And electoral Saxony, if there was a place that was the cradle or was the birthplace of Lutheranism, or at least was the place where it was being nourished the most and supported the most, it was right there. But right next to it is Ducal and Saxony, and they're not going to go with Luther because of their ruler, because of George of Saxony. And his death was a big deal because Duke George had been a bitter opponent of Luther, and at his death, his brother and successor Henry declared himself a Protestant, and Luther was invited to preach in the capital. So this area that had been strongly in opposition of Luther now not only is no longer in opposition to him, but the ruler is Protestant and invites Luther in to preach. So this is a big blow against Catholicism. With more areas turning Protestant, the Catholics in Germany created the League of Nuremberg to oppose the League of Schmalkalden. So they want to kind of try to fight back against what they see happening in Germany, which was turning Protestant. With his hands tied, Charles turned to a more conciliatory policy, encouraging peace between Catholics and Protestants. Again, because of political issues, he can't get the support he needs to go against the Protestants. So the best he can do is try to slow down the spread. And the only way he can do that is to try to get some cooperation going between Catholics and Protestants, bring in a little peace. So he does what he can, but it's really not going to be very effective. Germany seemed on the verge of being overrun by Protestantism. For more than 10 years, the emperor and the pope saw their power and influence diminish. So Protestants are running roughshod through Germany. They are taking more and more of the territories, are declaring themselves to be Protestant. The rulers, the princes of Germany, are taking on Protestantism. The Catholic influence is getting lower and lower and lower. And they're seeing the effect of this, the influence of the Catholic Church and the prominent leaders, the emperor, who is strongly for the Catholic Church, and the Pope, of course, who is, their power and influence are diminishing. But as is always the case in history, nothing really stays the way that you think it's going to. Just when you think you've got things figured out, the winds of history shift and blow in a different direction. And that's what happens to Protestantism. While everything was going great for them, all of a sudden things start to turn. Shortly thereafter, however, Protestantism would suffer several severe blows itself. The first was the bigamy of Philip of Hesse. So this is the guy who was in charge of the League of Schmalkalden. So he is very, very high up in the echelon of leadership in the Protestant church. He was firmly committed to the Protestant cause, yet his conscience was deeply troubled because for years he had had no marital relations with his wife, and he had found it impossible to remain celibate. So what we've got here is a dude who he's married, but he's not getting any physical relationship with his wife going on for what, I don't know why, whatever reason, she cut him off. And he's not willing to be cut off. So he's had to go out and find other women to take care of that urge of his. And he's feeling severe guilt about it. He knows it's wrong. He knows he shouldn't be doing it, but he doesn't know what the answer is. So he is consumed by guilt, and he decides he'd better consult the main Protestant theologians. So the guys that you're going to go to this point are three of them: Luther, Melanchthon, and Bucer. And they all agreed. They agreed that the Bible did not condemn polygamy and that Philip could take a second wife. This was a big mistake. These guys should have known that while, yes, there's nowhere in the scripture that says polygamy is a sin necessarily, there also is in the scripture the command to obey the laws of the land. And guess what? This had to be done in secret because it was illegal. So the advice that these guys who should have known better, the advice they gave Philip was not correct. It was incorrect. It was not just practically incorrect and morally incorrect, but it was actually scripturally incorrect. He was not allowed to do this, but he went along with what they said. They were the top guns. And Philip thinks, okay, this is my solution. I'll just get me another wife. And he did. And eventually, as these things are going to do, the secret came out and became public, and the resulting scandal put Philip and his theological advisors in a difficult position. So here are four of the most prominent leaders in the Protestant movement, and their hands are dirty now because they have done something that is illegal. Now, I guess the three guys didn't do something illegal, but they advised Philip to do something illegal, and he did do it illegally. And not only that, people can take the legality out of it and say, you know what, that's not right. I don't care if you can try to finesse your way into saying that it's okay scripturally to do that. It's not the way that we conduct ourselves, and this is immoral. You should not be taking on more wives. So, however that cards fall on that issue, the fact remains that you've got prominent leadership in the Protestant movement. I mean, the very top of it, giving advice to, go in secret and disobey the law of the land to do something that is very dubious to start with. So that's a pretty big blow. This also weakened the League of Schmalkalden, as many of its members objected to Philip's continuing leadership. They were kind of thinking, get this guy out of here. He's not fit to be the leader any longer. Look at what he has done. And so he didn't get kicked out of there, but some of the members really had a hard time with him continuing on his leadership role, and so that weakened it. The second blow came when Duke Maurice of Saxony refused to join the League. While declaring himself a Protestant, he preferred to remain independent. So here's this Duke. He's a Protestant, but he's not going along with this League. He said, hey, boys, I'm with you as far as being a Protestant, but as far as joining your little group, I'm not going in. I want to be the one who declares and decides what needs to happen. I don't want to have to go along with what this group says. So he stays independent. And while that in and of itself might not be too terrible, although it's not great, something happened that did make it really bad. This opened the door for Charles to persuade the Duke to join him in opposing the League of Schmalkalden. So basically, Charles came in and said, hey, Duke, I really am not in opposition to Protestantism, but these guys that are a part of this league, they've just been opposing me, and they're not going about things the right way. And so I'm looking to you for help, because I just want to make sure that proper respect is given to the emperor and the laws of the land are followed. And would you help me? And Maurice says, absolutely, I will. So now you've got a guy who is a prominent ruler who has declared himself a Protestant, but also is with Charles. So that's a problem. Well, there's another blow coming. The third blow was Luther's death in 1546. So the guy that started it all, he's gone now. At the time of his death, Luther remained the only leader who could unite Protestants under a single banner. His death left the Protestant party headless, both politically and spiritually. So the guy that, if anybody could bring unity to this group, if anybody that every side was going to at least respect because he started it all, now he's gone. And the fracture that's in the Protestant movement is never going to be repaired. And it's not, obviously not to this day. So with Luther out, even though his influence had kind of diminished because of this scandal with the bigamy stuff, he still was the guy that could do it all. He was the guy who, anybody that hoped for there to be unity, they had to hope it would come through Luther. Well, he's gone now. And so that's a big blow. But there's one more really big blow coming. Then the most severe blow was struck. The emperor was finally free to turn his attention to Germany. Things politically kind of cleared up a little bit, and people are not quite so crazy about Protestantism now because of some of the problems that have come out. Luther's gone, and all of a sudden Charles is free to finally do what he always wanted to do, an attack. So Charles invaded Germany, and he captured both Philip of Hesse and John Frederick, the son of Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise was the ruler who had helped Luther all along, and his son John Frederick was to be his successor. So it's a big deal. The guy that's kind of the up-and-coming guy that's going to be the Protestant leader as far as a ruler goes, now he's been captured by Charles, and this is going to be a problem. So Charles is feeling pretty good right now, but of course, again, the winds of history decide to blow in a different direction and things change once more. And so there's kind of an interim period now between the successes of Catholicism and then the push of Protestantism, and now Protestantism kind of taking a little bit of a downturn. And let's look and see what happens during this time. Despite the military victory, Charles knew it was too late to eliminate Protestantism. So it's doesn't spread too far. You can't fight a war against every single territory. You'd be tearing up a big portion of your own people. So stopping it is no longer an option. That left the building a long time ago. So instead, let's try to at least kind of get on the same page. So he gathered a group of Catholic and Protestant theologians who wrote a document entitled the Augsburg Interim. It was called the Interim because it was to stand as the law of the land in Germany until a general council could be convened to decide on the issues in debate. So these religious differences, these problems between the Catholic Church and the Protestant movement, Protestant churches, Lutheranism, they wanted to get a council together to try to hash it all out. But that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So they put together this interim kind of as a way of getting both sides to agree. And then with most things like this, these compromises never make either side happy, and they don't usually lead to anything good. Charles decided to bring Reformation to the church by prosecuting abuse and corruption, encouraging piety and learning, and disallowing any doctrinal divergence. So Charles did have some good ideas. He wanted to try to deal with some of the problems that had led to Reformation to begin with. He wanted to help bring unity. He had the right heart, but he just couldn't get out of the mindset of the Catholic Church was the only one that could exist. And he wasn't going to be accepted by everyone. In fact, at this point, he wouldn't really want to be accepted by anyone. But both Catholics and Protestants resisted the interim. Many Protestant theologians flatly refused to obey it. They were not going to compromise on what they believed. And this interim called for compromise. And they weren't going to do that. It didn't matter to them what the emperor wanted. It didn't matter to them, even some of their own theological leaders who were involved in this, they were not going to go along with them. And they didn't. So Charles was unable to exploit the advantages gained by his military victory. This big military victory for him just ended up being a dud because he couldn't bring about anything that he really wanted to do. He just could not get everyone on the same side, and he couldn't figure out how to go forward. And so what should have been a great victory for him and strengthening his power is actually going to lead to his demise. Many German princes, including some Catholics, protested against Charles for his treatment of Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony. Evidently, there was some really bad things he did to them in order to capture them, and there was talk about it was really bad. And what exactly they were, I'm not even quite sure, but whatever it was, it made both sides unhappy with him. And so he lost support there. The Protestant princes had been drawn back together in opposition of Charles. The Protestant group was kind of not getting along too well, but now that they had a common enemy, they came back together. So that hurt Charles too. They were kind of fractured and not heading in the right direction, but now he's given them this source of an outside enemy that they can all come together and agree this guy's got to go. And so that was not a good thing for him. Finally, both the Pope and the King of France, resenting the successes of Charles, made diplomatic moves against him. Again, the political part comes in. If anybody should have been on the side of Charles when it comes to these religious deals, it was the Pope and the King of France. They should have been in 100% alignment, but they were not in 100% alignment on political matters. And once again, political matters, even for the Pope, trump religious matters. And so even though Charles was good for them when it came to opposition against Protestantism, he was not, in their mind, good for them when it came to political power. And so down they were willing to make him go. Continuing on, soon the Protestant princes were conspiring against Charles V. Maurice of Saxony joined the conspiracy. So the guy that kind of had been with Charles and said, hey, yeah, I'll go along with you. Now he's not on board anymore. He's back with the Protestants. An embassy of the King of France was sent in order to secure his support. So even the King of France, they're getting him involved and hoping that they'll get support from him to go out against Charles. Then the rebellion broke out. The armies of King Henry II of France invaded Charles's possessions beyond the Rhine. Charles was forced to flee. So now Charles is on the move. He's on the run. The big emperor had fought a battle and had gained finally what he had always wanted, and that was to eliminate some of the Protestant leaders. It didn't work out for him at all. It was his downfall. And now he is actually on the run from the very forces that should have been on his side, and as the troops of the King of France. Charles had increasingly delegated German affairs to his brother Ferdinand, who finally agreed to the Peace of Passau. The agreement stipulated that Philip of Hesse and John Frederick of Saxony be freed. Freedom of religion was granted throughout the empire. So you may be thinking, wow, man, that is a big time move. I mean, that is years ahead of its time. Everybody's going to have the right to choose their own religion. Well, not exactly. This freedom was not for all subjects, but for the local rulers to decide what religion their territory would practice. It also only applied to Catholics, or those who held to the Confession of Augsburg, so that would have been the Lutherans, which meant that Anabaptists and Reformed were not included. So there's some pretty strong caveats to this. It's not just for everybody. You can't just go decide what church you want to be a part of. That didn't exist yet. But a ruler could decide for his territory, we're either going to be Protestant or we're going to be Catholic. But even in that, the only Protestants that count, all Catholics counted, but the only Protestants that counted were those who held to the Confession of Augsburg, so pretty much Lutheranism. So the Anabaptists, nope, you're out. The Reformed, nope, you're out. You don't get to be part of this. So while it does guarantee freedom of religion, it's still very controlled. But for its time, it was progressive because remember, no time in history before this all happened would there have ever been any kind of movement against the Catholic Church that would have survived. Not since it gained power, and especially the power of the state with the entrance of Constantine into the church. These people would have been wiped out immediately. Luther would not have survived very long. They'd have burned him at the stake in a heartbeat and laughed about it after it was over. But God chose the right time for it to happen, and it did. And here we are. This is a guarantee of the territories in Germany getting to decide for themselves what religion they were going to practice. That's a big deal. The failure in Germany, along with other factors, led Charles to relinquish his power and seek the peace of the monastery. In 1556, he resigned as emperor and moved to the monastery of Justo. And this is back in Spain. So Charles has had enough. And it's probably a good move on his part. These leaders, once they start getting on the run, if they keep fighting back, they either end up in prison or they end up dead. And he decides, you know what? I've fought this enough. And I'm not getting any more control. I'm losing power. Let me just go hang out at the monastery. And I'll leave this for other people to deal with. So he did. It was a good move on his part. He walked away from it and left it for others. Charles died in 1558, so he only made it 2 more years anyway, but at least he did have those 2 years not on the run. His brother Ferdinand I took control. Ferdinand abandoned his brother's religious policy by being very tolerant. So Ferdinand kind of looked at Charles and thought, this is a headache that I don't need. And so I'm going to just do the opposite of what Charles did. Instead of fighting this constantly, I'm going to just be tolerant. I'm going to allow these places to practice the religion that they wanted to practice. And in fact, it was so bad in the Catholics' mind that many of them started accusing Ferdinand of being a Protestant himself. They thought that any day now he was going to just stand up and declare he was a Protestant. It didn't happen, but he definitely was very tolerant, and it, in a lot of ways, was helpful for him personally because he didn't have to fight this fight. Even though there were those that didn't like what he was doing, didn't like that, he still didn't have to deal with the stuff that Charles did. So he was willing to learn from his brother's mistakes, and that's a good thing. Under his rule and that of his successor, Maximilian II, Protestantism continued its expansion to new areas. So as you can imagine, with a tolerant ruler, Protestantism is going to do very well, and it does. It really expands now during his rule and takes more and more ground. So now it's time to turn to an area near Germany that begins its own Reformation movement and see how Lutheranism affected that. And so we're going to look at Scandinavian Lutheranism. While all of this was taking place in Germany, Luther's impact was being felt in Scandinavia. Though Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were considered a united kingdom, in actuality, the king ruled only Denmark. So even though they were considered to be a united area, Scandinavia, they really weren't under the same rule. Denmark was ruled by the king. The other 2 places they pushed up against the king, and he didn't really have a lot of say there. When the Reformation broke out in Germany, Christian II was king in Scandinavia. So you got this guy, Christian II. Remember, he's really only the king of Denmark, but he wants to also control Norway and Sweden. And as we're going to see here in a moment, it didn't work out real well for him. Since Sweden would not allow him effective power in their land, Christian II, who was married to Charles V's sister, asked his brother-in-law to help him. So Christian comes to Charles, who he's at this point, he's still doing good as for his downturn. And he says, hey, I want to get some more say in Sweden, and I'm on your side. I'm married to your sister, and this is going to help you out because I'm your brother-in-law, and I'm definitely on board with keeping the Catholic Church in charge. So why don't you give me a helping hand? And Charles was all too happy to do that. With troops sent by Charles and other foreign princes, Christian moved into Sweden and had himself crowned at Stockholm. So he comes on in and by force gets himself a crown. And you can imagine that the citizens there didn't really take too kindly to that. A few days later, he had the nation's leading aristocrats and ecclesiastics murdered. Now, one of the things Christian had said when he came in was that he was not going to kill any of these aristocrats and he was not going to kill any of these ecclesiastics. But he didn't live up to that. He killed them anyway. So this is going to really leave a bad taste in people's mouth. This became known as the Massacre of Stockholm. His actions created resentment in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So even the place where he was ruling in Denmark didn't like him anymore. They thought that this was disgusting behavior on his part to go slaughter these people that he said he wasn't going to kill. So this was not a popular move on his part, and it was a huge miscalculation on his part and a big mistake. Christian next tried to use the Reformation as a tool for his own ends. Protestantism had spread into Denmark, and the people there were ready to listen. So Christian wanted to kind of get in on this and kind of be on the bandwagon of the Protestant movement when he saw that it was coming in and getting a lot of popularity. But the Lutheran preachers, they didn't want to be associated with Christian because of this massacre. And so they didn't go along with him, so that didn't help him. Eventually, rebellion broke out, and Christian was forced to flee. Frederick I succeeded him. When Christian tried to return 8 years later, and by try to return, that means he came in with an army to try to retake the office of being king again. And when he did that, he was defeated and imprisoned for the rest of his life. And that wasn't just a few years. He wasn't an old man about to die. He stayed in prison for 27 years. So Christian was a pretty disgusting dude, and he got what he probably got better than he had coming to him, but it didn't end well for him. So we can all feel good about that at least. Frederick I was a Protestant, and by this time many among the nobility were as well. But Frederick promised that he would not attack Catholicism nor favor Protestantism. He also gave up all claims to the Swedish crown and allowed Norway to elect its own king. Well, guess what? They in turn elected Frederick I. So Frederick decides that he's not going to make the same mistakes as Christian did. And instead of trying to be a tyrant, he tries to be conciliatory and to work with people. And lo and behold, they liked that. And they even elected him king in Norway. So now he's got that territory that Christian had wanted to get, but he couldn't get with his methods. And he also does good with the religious deal. He does just exactly what makes sense. Just leave it alone. Don't attack either one. You're a Protestant, but that doesn't mean you have to go out against the Catholics. Let people do what they want to do, what their conscience says, and let these territories decide for themselves. Let these nations decide for themselves. And unlike Christian, Frederick's rule turns out to go pretty well for him. Protestantism allowed free reign, made rapid gains. So in this environment, just like in Germany, now Protestantism is going to really pump forward. In 1527, it was officially recognized and granted toleration. So officially now it's okay to practice and be a Protestant. There hadn't really been opposition, but now there's not even opposition in theory. By the time of Frederick's death in 1533, most of his subjects were Protestants. So the country quickly turned to Protestantism. The new ruler was Christian III, a devout Lutheran who had been present at the Diet of Worms and greatly admired Luther. Now, Christian's going to be a little bit more pushy than Frederick was. He is going to try to push Protestantism, and he does. Christian III took measures in support of both Protestantism and requested teachers from Luther to help him in the work of Reformation. So he asked Luther, hey, bring in some of your guys, bring them on in. We need help. And they'll help teach the people about what it means to be a part of the Reformation. And they did. Eventually, the entire Danish church subscribed to the Confession of Augsburg. So they turned to Lutheranism. In Sweden, events followed a similar course. When Christian II sought to impose his authority on the country, so go back to when Christian II came in and tried to and had himself crowned king, there was a young man there named Gustavus Vasa. And during this battle, he was taken prisoner. He escaped the country, but returned upon hearing of the massacre of Stockholm. So he got out of there. He was taken prisoner, but he escaped. But when he found out what happened with that massacre of Stockholm, he wanted to get back because he wasn't having that. Living among the people, he organized a national rebellion. So he kind of was a grassroots movement type of guy. Just with the common people, he gets an army together. And they're not very organized. They're definitely not like an official army of the land, but they are effective. Victories followed. Victory after victory followed. And his name became legendary. In 1523, the people named him king, but the royal title carried little authority among the nobility and the prelates. Slowly, Gustavus Vasa went about dividing his enemies. He was able to drive a wedge between the clergy and nobility and between both of these groups and the rest of the population. So he kind of got everybody mad at each other. Instead of fighting him, they were all fighting one another, and that's a good position for him to be in. He's on the outside looking in, and he can kind of step in where needed, and he's in control of things. So this was a smart guy, and he really did a good job in uniting the country. The bishops rebelled, and Gustavus convened a national assembly. So there was a big bishops' rebellion. And so Gustavus gets everybody together. He's getting people from all over the place. It's not just clergy. It's not just high echelon of the aristocracy. He's even got members of the bourgeois there, and even lower than that. So he's got everybody in the country represented. When the clergy and nobility banded together to oppose him, now check this move out. This is smooth. He simply resigned, declaring that Sweden was not ready for a true king. So he just said, you know what, guys, you're right. I'm beating my head against the wall here. You're absolutely right. You know how to do things better than me. This country's not ready for a king. Let me just resign. And he knew what was going to happen. He was smart. And here's what happened. 3 days later, threatened by chaos. So the whole thing now, without a leader in charge, this is a big fat mess. And these guys, they were thinking that they were going to keep him in charge, but they were going to control him. He wasn't going to be controlled. And they realized we have done messed up. The assembly recalled the king, agreeing to curb the power of the prelates. They said, this is a mess we got on our hands now. Get that king back here. What does he want? Oh, he doesn't want these guys to be able to have control. Well, that's fine. And so he comes back more powerful than ever. The result was that the clergy lost its political power. Thank goodness. Lutheran influence was on the rise. By the time Gustavus Vasa died in 1560, Sweden was a Protestant country. So that takes us to the end of looking at this little period of the expansion of Lutheranism throughout Germany and into the Scandinavian lands. Thanks for taking time with me today. Hope that you enjoyed this. We'll continue our pilgrimage through Christian history from the time of the Reformation to modern days next week, and I hope you can join me then. In the meantime, God bless.